make a start? So welcome everyone to the 4th online roundtable in our Shelley 200 series and our first event of the new year. We're now, of course, in the bicentenary year of Shelley's death, and our Shelley 200 series is leading ever closer to the Shelley Conference, which will take place at Keach's house in London from 8th to 9th July this summer. Our event this evening is on Shelley's Jane poems written to, about, or inspired by Jane Williams. And today's date, January 26th, marks the beginnings of the series of poems. This evening's event has very much been prompted by one of our conference advisors, Will Bowers, who reminded me that Edward Williams' entry in his journal for 26 January reads, "S sent us some beautiful but too melancholy lines. This is the poem to The Serpent Is Shut Out from Paradise, considered the first of the Jane poems. In terms of a date of composition, it's the opinion of the Longman Poems of Shelley editors, Wills told me, that it was done only a few days before the 26th, hence the date of our gathering this evening to admire and discuss Shelley's last lyrics. In order to spotlight a selection of these lyrics, each of our speakers will deliver a short presentation on a Jane poem of their choice, followed by a roundtable discussion. So I'm Amanda Blake Davis. I'm an organizer of the Shelley Conference and our Shelley 200 series of events, along with the lead organizer, Anna Mercer, Fish Coffee, and Paul Stevens. We would like to thank our advisory board, Will Bowers, Madeleine Callaghan, Kelvin Everest, and Sharon Rustin, and our postgraduate helpers, Laura Blunsden and Anna Romanelli, for all of their support in shaping the conference and events. And I would especially like to thank our speakers this evening, Merrilees Roberts, William Keach, Kelvin Everest, and Madeleine Callaghan, who I'll now introduce to you following a few bits of Zoom housekeeping. So we ask the audience to please keep your cameras off and microphones muted during this event in order to limit disruptions. Everyone's very much encouraged to use the chat box as you've already been doing throughout the event. And during the Q&A at the end of this event, you'll have the opportunity to unmute yourself and appear on screen if you wish to ask a question. Or you may type questions into the chat box at any point during this event, and we'll pick them up in the Q&A at the end. You may use the raise hand function during the Q&A as well. And I'll remind you of that when we get to that point. If you encounter any technical difficulties, please do type into the chat box or contact Anna, Bish, or Paul, or myself. This event is being recorded and will be uploaded to our YouTube channel and our conference website, theshelleyconference.com. Please do visit our website to watch past roundtables and video interviews with our advisory board and for information on the Shelley Conference. And just a reminder that our call for papers is open and will close on Monday, 7th February. Without further ado, it's a great honor to introduce this evening's speakers. Madeleine Callaghan is Senior Lecturer in Romantic Literature at the University of Sheffield. Along with an abundance of articles and chapters on Shelley, her monographs include Shelley's Living Artistry, Letters, Poems, Plays, published with Liverpool in 2017, The Poet Hero in the Work of Byron and Shelley with Anthem in 2019, and the forthcoming Eternity in British Romantic Poetry with Liverpool later this year, which explores the representation of the relationship between eternity and the mortal world in the poetry of the period. She assisted Michael O'Neill and Anthony Howe with the Oxford Handbook of Percy Bysshe Shelley in 2013, co-edited the Romantic Poetry Handbook with Michael O'Neill in 2017, and most recently she has co-edited with Anthony Howe Romanticism and the Letter, published in 2020. Kelvin Everest is Emeritus Bradley Professor of Modern Literature at the University of Liverpool and an editor of the Longman Poems of Shelley, the final volume of which will be published later this year, and includes the Jane poems, newly edited by Kelvin. His many publications include Coleridge's Secret Ministry, 1979, Reflections of Revolution, Images of Romanticism, co-edited with Alison Yarrington in 1993 and republished in 2016, and The Heart's Echoes, an article of 2019 in the Keach Shelley Review, originally delivered as a keynote lecture of the same name at the 2017 Shelley Conference. Kelvin's latest monograph, Keats and Shelley, Winds of Light, was published with Oxford University Press just less than a month ago on New Year's Eve. William Keach is Professor Emeritus of English at Brown University. He is the author of numerous publications, including the monographs Elizabethan Erotic Narratives of 1976, Shelley's Style of 1984, and Arbitrary Power, Romanticism, Language, Politics of 2004. He has edited Coleridge, The Complete Poems for the Penguin English Poet Series. William's significant contributions to the field of Romantic studies were recognized with a Distinguished Scholar Award from the Keach-Shelley Association of America in 1998. In October last year, William delivered a lecture at the Keach-Shelley Association of America Stuart Kern Symposium, 1820, Aesthetics, Politics, and the Legacies of Romanticism, entitled The Politics of Hope, Shelley, 1820. And Merrilees Roberts is a teaching associate at Queen Mary, University of London. She is the author of Shelley's Poetics of Reticence, Shelley's Shame, published by Routledge in 2020. This work explores the rhetorical and phenomenological links between shame and reticence, and sheds new light on the psychology of Shelley's anguished poet subject. Textual strategies of reticence, the force of that which is unspoken, obscured, withheld, or made to speak in a register other than the discursive, are shown to express the shame of Shelley's struggle to transcend his historical moment and his anxieties about the nature of aesthetic self-representation. She has also written on Shelley's engagement with the philosophies of sympathy, his ideas about the Promethean poet, and on affect theory. She is currently interested in theories and practices of eroticism and second-generation Romantic writing, and in the connection between Romantic science and aesthetic theory. So thank you all so much for joining us here. I'm very much looking forward to your presentations and discussion. So we'll begin presentations on selected Jane poems as presented by our speakers. And we're going to commence sort of an invitation into the Jane poems with Maddie speaking on To Jane, the Invitation. Maddie.
Thanks so much for such a generous introduction, and also for all of the events you guys have organised. It's been really incredible to listen and be a part of this. So when I return, as I often do, to Jane, the Invitation, I'm struck by Shelley's attention to and fascination with genre. For me, the poem pivots upon all the major questions of how we approach, understand, and work with lyric. The lyric is a problem, especially the Romantic lyric. Even Muller Zettelman and Margaret Rubik write almost in sorrow that there is neither a generally accepted and comprehensive definition nor a differentiated toolkit for analysis. We are left chasing shadows. But Hegel glories in the lyric poet's freedom when finding no poetic Bibles for writing lyric. Standing at the intersection between artifice and truth, lyric is a beacon for any artist who would push poetry to revise its norms, its assumptions, and the values implicit in genre that dictate, as Shelley's defense says, the shape and action of what is written in verse. Challenge to an embrace of the problem of generic norms is the hallmark or maybe specialness of To Jane, the Invitation. William Keach notes with his typical acumen that the Jane poems are haunted by Byron and Mary Shelley, as he points out. Yes. The haunting is at the level of the line, and they are not the only presences. Milton and Wordsworth, to name a couple, lie within these poems too, helping Shelley to shape and focus some of his highest lyric achievements. But I want to focus for a moment upon Wordsworth in the light of this poem. Harold Bloom wonderfully senses the elegiac quality of the Jane poems. What I see as equally at play is Shelley's interest in absence and presence. And this is the very essence of Wordsworth's Lucy poems. Lyric for Shelley had been the site of some of Wordsworth's most important experimentation. We know how deeply Shelley responded to the Lucy poems, paying graceful tribute to their achievement in The Witch of Atlas, for example. What Lucy was for Wordsworth within the poems, Shelley would respond to in the figure of Jane. For Wordsworth brought into plain sight the problem of lyric address. Who is Lucy? How might we understand her? Why can we never catch sight of her? Shelley learns from Wordsworth. For in the Jane poems, we seem, but only ever seem, to know really who Jane is and what she means here, how Shelley really feels and what these poems might mean or communicate about the man's life. Cian Duffy, writing beautifully about the poems, isolates the key point from which all studies of these poems must proceed, namely the inability to exactly determine the relations between poetry and lived experience. And this inability leads us to the problem of genre. How do we understand the lyric? Lyric experimentation could mean a freedom from demands of plot, sanction brevity, and allow the voice, either oral or written, to shape the poem. But it could also enforce a mode founded upon what Hegel referred to as the language of the poetic inner life, that must draw upon the poet's unique experience and feeling, even as these feelings possess what he refers to as a universal validity. Hawking feelings as wares, the poet has to be both one individual and every person, plumbing their own subjective depths, even as they transform the I into a cipher, freed from the constraints of the real world and real human relationships. So we see the dramatic that Barry Weller picks up on so beautifully in this poem, the Shakespearean, the dramatic, the artificial, combined with very real historical facts from Shelley's personal life. To Jane, the invitation displays its virtuosity rather than admits to mere verity. But that stubborn embedding of a knowable and recognizable self gnaws away at any hope to efface entirely the identity of the speaker, to free ourselves finally of self, that burr that will stick to one. Lyric is and remains an enigma, and so is to Jane an invitation, the invitation. It lingers at that dangerously porous boundary line between fiction and reality, thumbing its nose at the reader, always a step ahead of the would-be interpreter, even if it goads her on. With Wordsworth's Lucy, Epipsychodian's Emily, and now Shelley's Jane, we ask ourselves, how do we unpick lyric contradiction, where its exuberant artifice, identified by Jonathan Culler, clashes with John Stuart Mill's belief in lyric's fundamental emotional honesty? We are troubled by how poetry and life might meet, for Shelley makes it so. To Jane, the invitation brooks no easy interpretations, no critical sleight of hand that will simplify its power. Shelley's poetry, with all its wit, its emotional charge, its gleaming artifice, will not and cannot allow us to forget the dangerous quality of the meeting between life and art embedded into lyric. With Shelley's lyric, by definition, always resisting definition, we are asked to witness, to challenge, and participate in what lyric can do. Thank you.
Yeah, Maddie, that was brilliant. So much to think about. I hope we'll return to these points later in the discussion portion of this event. So we're moving on now to Jane the Invitation's accompanying poem, To Jane the Recollection, and I turn now to Merrilees.
Hello, everyone, and thank you very much, Amanda and all the organisers, for inviting me to speak one of these fantastic events. So, the recollection begins with an apostrophic appeal to memory, to rise, to create an epitaph of glory fled. The glory being, we are told, the last day of a certain felicity which existed for the lyric speaker before the earth has changed its face. The first three lines read, "Now the last day of many days, all beautiful and bright as thou, the loveliest and the last is dead." These lines simultaneously address a last day of glorying in Jane's presence and Jane herself as an absent thou, and set the tone for the rest of the poem, which weaves together eros with reflection on the mimetic powers of poetic memory and imagination. This opening engagement with the way poetry can record, alter, or compensate for reality morphs throughout the poem into a meditation on the reassurance and sexual limerence the speaker experiences in proximity to Jane, who he sees as the one fair form who filled with love the lifeless atmosphere. In one sense, the forest scene is lifeless because it describes a walk taken in winter by Jane, Shelley, and Mary in early 1822. But the curious combination of life-giving presence and lifeless atmospheres also provides a psychological realism, which I think quite wryly demonstrates the effort required by Shelley to manage his complicated emotions at this time. These poems strike a different tone for me to some of Shelley's other erotic writing, which aims at fluid alignments between the physical and the ideal. The Jane poems simultaneously recognize desire, loss, lust, frustration, estrangement, emotional stasis, and belligerence, and bind them together into overarching gestures of poetic and psychological control. Many readers think that the closing lines of this poem enact Shelley's shutting out of his wife from his mind in favour of Jane. Here are those closing lines. Like one beloved, the scene had lent to the dark water's breast its every leaf and lineament with more than truth expressed, until an envious wind crept by like an unwelcome thought, which from the mind's too faithful eye blots one dear image out. Though thou art ever fair and kind, and forests ever green, less oft is peace in Shelley's mind than calm in water seen. This blotting out of unwelcome images provides a way into reading the whole poem as a defiant attempt to keep one memory and one mental state filled with erotic affect alive in the imagination, even when this is only intermittently effective. The poem is both the record of and the success of the qualified pleasure of the mental effort it took for Shelley to linger on the life-giving presence of Jane. Tangles of affects and intersubjective needs are compressed together in the lyric form. And this enacts something like Goethe's Faust wanting one moment of pleasure to remain thou art so beautiful, an idea which we know was a great inspiration for Shelley at this time. I feel that these poems do not employ the kind of eroticism which sustains desire through denial and lack, but rather that they use the lyric form to hold the mind together in moments of psychological strain. This is a form of mimesis which makes poetic form adequate to the affects which shape it. This is perhaps clearest in part 4 of the recollection, which I will quickly read. How calm it was, the silence there, by such a chain was bound that even the busy woodpecker made stiller by her sound the inviolable quietness. The breath of peace we drew with its soft motion made not less the calm that round us grew. There seemed from the remotest seat of the white mountain waste to the soft flower beneath our feet a magic circle traced, a spirit interfused around, a thrilling silent life. To momentary peace it bound our mortal nature's strife. And still I felt the centre of the magic circle there was one fair form that filled with love the lifeless atmosphere. This momentary peace comes at the price of a certain stagnation and alienation from the scene around the speaker. His response is to create a stillness and silentness which, curiously, is only made more inviolable by the slight disturbance of a woodpecker. Here, the defiance of lingering on illicit desire is present in a tangible silence which claims sound as its own mode of operation. Just like the speaker claims one single thread of his reality, his moments of pleasure with Jane, as his whole reality. Here, a sensitivity to desensitization, to a kind of stupefied yet hard-won pleasure, which also manifests as stasis and lifelessness, is given an erotic thrill in acting as a manifestation of poetic control. This jealous corralling of particular experience seeks to pause time and occlude awareness of life conceives as the kind of inexorable process it is for Shelley in The Triumph of Life. Seeing emotional control and poetic control as ontologically inseparable opens up these poems, I think, to readings based on complex fusions and interchanges of affect in this poem, as opposed to readings which might focus more on power dynamics between the Jane and Shelley personae or on the psychodynamics of Shelley's or his speakers' minds. Thank you.
Thank you, Merrilees. Thank you for that wonderful insight and such beautiful readings of the poem as well. Thank you for that. So we'll move now to With a Guitar to Jane, and Kelvin will be speaking to us on this poem.
Okay. Am I on?
Yeah, you're on. We can hear you.
Okay, well, thanks for inviting me, and thanks everyone for tuning in as well. With a Guitar to Jane combines a relaxed, confident artistry, witty, cultured, idiomatic, with light intimations of emotional darkness and troubled relationships. Its poise embodies, I think, 4 qualities which are pervasive in Shelley's late lyric poetry and in the poems to Jane. There's an effortless and apparently memorial saturation in the English and European lyric tradition. There's a close familiarity with central strains in European philosophy, particularly Greek with a guitar. And there's a readiness to include personal experience as a perspective on larger questions of meaning and value. And then perhaps above all, there's a power to suffuse narrated experience or natural description with the perception of their metaphoric life. In this Shelleyan perspective, everything perceived is instinct with a metaphoric import, which doesn't ever need to be expressed as a "this thing is like that thing" formula. I think the 2 Jane poems, The Invitation and The Recollection, which we've just been hearing about, are actually the most perfect examples of this quality, but With a Guitar has it too, in its implicit meditation on audience and on the recurrence through centuries of continually reborn dimensions of human experience. But there's a further distinctive feature of the late lyrics, which finds maybe its best exemplar in With a Guitar, and that is the subtle artistry of Shelley's late lyrics style. And I'm going to concentrate on that. So the opening 16 lines of With a Guitar establish the meter as octosyllabics with an iambic pulse. That distinguishes this late style from, for example, the 7-syllable meter of Euganean Hills, where the basic trochaic pulse gives a sort of chanted effect, which in its troubled seriousness is quite unlike guitar's blend of intellectual and artistic confidence with hinted emotional frailty, but only hinted. From the very beginning of the poem, though, from the very beginning, the octosyllabic pattern is varied by an opening line which has an initial trochee, and in fact a first word, aerial, which has an ambivalent scansion. Is that 2 syllables or 3? Aerial. The lyric voice of the poem has indeed an aerial-like, quicksilver and protean character. The rhythmic pulse shifts between octosyllabic and 7-syllable lines to such an extent that of the poem's 90 lines, 1/3 diverge from the basic pattern, and there are 25 7-syllable lines, including a sustained cluster from lines 18 to 20. The impression of metrically fluid shape changing is compounded by trochaic substitution at the beginning of lines, which is the case in 33 lines, more than 1/3 of the whole. And Shelley's sophisticated, confident lightness of tone is achieved in particular by a fluent onward impetus in the verse movement, which depends on run-on lines, which make up the majority of the poem. 50 run-on lines out of the 90, with some run-ons clustered to groups of 3, 4, or in one case 5 successive lines. A sense of easy conversational flow is underpinned by recurrent deployment of strong medial pauses within run-on lines, as in the 3 lines, "It talks according to the wit of its companions, and no more is heard than has been felt before." That's a very characteristic movement. And one can see in that typical example how the seemingly effortless meeting of the couplet rhyme demand anchors the constant prosodic variation with a feeling of underlying control. The playfully protean shaping of the verse also rests on a diction which deploys various aerial-like dubieties of scansion, such that it's sometimes a question whether a given line has got 7 or 8 or some other number of syllables. Consider the present participles is whispering 2 or 3 syllables. And the comparatives, happier, for example, and words where elision is an option, quite a lot of those. Words like heaven or driven. There are two obvious models for Shelley's lyric voice in With a Guitar. It's certain that he was reading The Tempest and Comus at the same time as he wrote that poem. Prospero's 20-line epilogue to The Tempest varies 7 and 8 syllable lines, with an iambic pulse and some trochaic substitution in the first foot. If you just read those 20 lines, you're immediately very, very suggestive of the manner exactly of guitar. But the attendant spirit's closing speech in Comus offers an even closer model, with constant variation in the syllable count and an almost even mix of iambic and trochaic feet, combined with frequent divergence from a nevertheless supremely confident air of control. Shelley exactly catches its manner of playful invention within formal constraint. The brilliant central conceit of With a Guitar to Jane parallels the spirit of Ariel, reincarnated within Shelley's body, with the spirit of the pine tree, reincarnated with the guitar made from its wood. The conceit is inflected in the poem to bring out the key similitude of the guitar and the poem. The guitar is only as good as the skill of its performer, and the poem is only as good as its reader. It needs a skilled and sympathetic audience in order to come alive. That's it.
Thank you, Kelvin, for that remarkably skillful reading of With a Guitar to Jane. It was wonderful. So we'll move now to our final presentation. William will be speaking on Lines Written in the Bay of Lerici, or Bright Wanderer, Fair Coquette of Heaven. William.
Thank you, Amanda, and thanks to you and Kelvin for inviting me to participate in this roundtable, and to Maddie and Merrilees for their very interesting and provocative talks. My focus is on the poem we're now beginning to call by its first line, Bright Wanderer, Fair Coquette of Heaven, instead of Lines Written in the Bay of Lerici, the title Richard Garnett gave it when he first published a version of it in 1862. I have to confess a lingering attachment to the old title, perhaps in part because Lerici is only a front vowel or so away from Lirici or Lyrike, which gives you Lines Written in the Bay of Lyrics. I still have questions about the new opening Shelley gave this brilliant and disturbed and disturbing poem when he squeezed 6 additional lines into the space at the top of the first page of the manuscript. So now, instead of she left me at the silent time when the moon had ceased to climb the azure dome of heaven's steep, Bright Wanderer begins by addressing the moon directly and by seeming to contrast its status as fair coquette of heaven with Jane Williams, one fair as you, but far more true. But this is the only instance of the word coquette in the Shelley Concordance. Ironically, it's this one instance that appears in the OED as the Romantic era example of the primary definition, a woman who trifles with men's affection. There are 15 instances of coquette in the Byron Concordance, but they chose the Shelley one instance for the OED. In Kelvin Everest's headnote to this poem in the forthcoming 5th volume of the Longman edition, he says of a postscript to Jane Williams's 6 July letter to Shelley that it certainly suggests the coquette of the first line of Bright Wanderer. Now, this is a point worth further discussion, I think, not least because it complicates our sense that the rising moon as coquette stands only in contrast to one fair as you, but far more true. Is Jane both, or could Jane be both fair coquette and one far more true? The complications of the moon's double appearance at the beginning of Bright Wanderer, as both coquette and an albatross asleep balanced on her wings of light, need to be worked out in relation to its shifting status in other Jane poems or poems associated with this period, as well as in Epipsychidion, where Emilia Emily is figured as thou moon beyond the clouds, and Mary Shelley as the cold chaste moon. These opening complications pervade Bright Wanderer, which, as has often been noted, is more about the speaker's awareness of his own unstable feelings than about Jane herself, whose departure and absence constitute the poem's founding circumstances. For 18 lines following the second "She left me," the speaker gives himself to the immediate moment of ambivalent recollection. There are no references to the physical setting. Then, with a turn on "but soon," the demon of frustrated desire reassumed his throne. It's at this point that the speaker turns outward again to the bay and watches the vessels glide along the ocean bright and wide. This movement culminates in an extraordinary anaphoric sequence of "and" clauses, the last one of which shatters the mood of momentarily restorative compensation in the figure of the fisher with his lamp and spear. The alluring and delusive flame of the lamp replaces and also recalls the ambiguous light of the moon in the poem's opening lines. And is there any way not to see the speaker? I need to call him Shelley now, as both the fisher and the fish. In commenting briefly on the last 4 lines of Bright Wanderer, I want to stress the inseparability of the poem's textual and affective unresolvedness. The syntax, in what the Longman notes following Judith Chernek's 1972 analysis, read as an unmistakable final quatrain. The syntax is knotty and despairingly aphoristic. Editors have been unable to agree on whether what appears to be the final line should read "Seeking life alone, not peace," G.M. Matthews, Chernak, the Penguin Selected Poems in Prose, and the Longman edition, or "Destroying life alone, not peace," the Norton Critical edition. In volume 7 of the Johns Hopkins edition of the Complete Poetry, Nora Crook takes yet a different editorial direction, printing a catalectic line 58, "Destroying life, not peace," followed by "seeking," as the first word in what she suggests might have been the final line of a closing triplet. No matter which editorial decisions we prefer, we are left with an unresolvable conflict between knowledge and desire. I'll close by juxtaposing the last lines of Bright Wanderer with passages from 2 other poems written near the end of Shelley's life. Here are the last lines of The Triumph of Life, the manuscript pages of which surround the 2 pages on which Bright Wanderer was drafted. "Then what is life?" I said. The cripple cast his eye upon the car which now had rolled onward, as if that look must be the last, and answered, "Happy those for whom the fold of," and the draft breaks off. And here's the Longman version of the last 4 lines of Bright Wanderer. "Too happy they whose pleasure sought extinguishes all sense and thought of the regret that pleasure," square brackets indicating the missing rhyme word, "seeking life alone, not peace." As Susan Wolfson observes, Shelley might have rhymed the terminal piece here with "cease," as he did, but in reverse order, at the end of the 6th stanza of "The Serpent Is Shut Out from Paradise," a poem he gave to Edward Williams some 5 months earlier with the request that he show it to no one but Jane. "Doubtless there is a place of peace where my weak heart and all its throbs will cease." At the end of Bright Wanderer, we may see Shelley as resisting this kind of death-seeking cease, peace rhyme or couplet. But we're still left wondering about his ever finding a way to overcome the antagonism between what the poem calls pleasure and peace, between his own passionate desire and the self-determination of Jane Williams and all the others he's loved. Thank you.
Thank you, William. That was wonderful. And I can't stop thinking about this Bay of Lirici as being so suffused with the lyric, a lyric just saturated within lyric. This is wonderful. Thank you. Thank you so much for these presentations, which I think will move us so flawlessly into our discussion. So we're going to enter the discussion portion of this event now, and we'll carry on until about 8 o'clock, after which we'll pick up some questions from the audience. So do our speakers need a glass of water or anything before we get started with the discussion? No, all good? Great. So my first question, the Jane poems seem to be at once private love lyrics and also markedly public dramatic poems, colored by Shakespearean allusion, as you've touched on. For instance, in Shelley's poetic thoughts, Richard Cronin compellingly situates With the Guitar to Jane as a poem of wit in the courtly tradition of the late 16th and early 17th centuries. The Guitar to Jane, Cronin writes, is a witty poem, and witty in a distinctively 17th century manner. So I'm just wondering, thinking about this courtly tradition, and more broadly, what role do audiences play in these poems?
I'll just kick things off by saying it's a very good question, and the Cronin quotation is one that it's a passage that's interested me for a long time, because I've sensed, I don't know if Maddie and Merrilees feel this, that especially into Jane Recollection and Jane Invitation and Jane Recollection, I'm always made to think of Herrick, and to some extent of Marvel, and that is in the versification, but also in the kind of urbane tone and playful, erotic manner that also engages sometimes in surprising ways serious things. I tried to track down Shelley's reading of Marvel and Herrick and never really got very far with but that doesn't keep me from thinking that Cronin was onto something important there. And I wonder if the rest of you have felt this or have other things to say about it.
Well, I definitely think that Shelley must have known Herrick. There's a kind of genetic affinity, which you can't nail in a scholarly way, but it's just seems unmistakable. I've been thinking a lot about that too. About it's the 17th centuryness is almost an aspect of the reincarnation thing that's going on in With a Guitar. It's as if he's making the kind of contemporaries of Shakespeare's poetic culture come alive again in his voice. So that's one of the kind of things that's going on. And again, you can't nail it, but you can hear Drayton actually, and Donne and Daniel, and Godwin in a very early letter when Shelley was in his early discipleship of Godwin does say something like Shakespeare and Spenser all very well, but don't forget about all the others like Drayton and Daniel, and reels off some people. Given Shelley's kind of obsession with Godwin at that time, I'm sure he will have gone away at an early stage if he hadn't already found them. Because I do think I agree with William and with Richard Cronin that it's what I meant by a memorial saturation in the lyric tradition. It's almost as if he doesn't need a library or something. He just sort of knows them all. They're all in his head already.
I love that. And I keep thinking about the idea of that inheritance that you were talking about, the idea of it almost as a kind of dialogue that's opened up. Shelley's so saturated and so aware. I was thinking about the letter from Julia to Juan that Byron does, that kind of wonderfully dramatic and yet intimate letter that Shelley praises so highly in the letter, where, Julia is witty, she is manipulative, she is brilliant, she is emotional, and that kind of ability to play with language. And so I'm looking at it and I'm looking at the kind of Marvell quality that I think is absolutely there. But the thing that takes my breath away every time is reading through the invitation, and then you get to suddenly line 20 after all these fantastic, beautiful moments of artifice. Then we get that line, like one on whom thou smilest, dear. That dear, no other poet could manage dear in those terms, that intimacy of adoration after this kind of sparkling, glittery perfection. So I suppose I'm thinking, yes, there's absolutely wit, but what I'm obsessed with is that leavening of wit with affection and depth and the layering, I suppose, that Shelley manages, that I think is something that he shares with Byron, that mingling of those levels so beautifully and carefully.
I'll add something to that. I think you're absolutely right, Madeleine. Yeah, about the mixture of very playful, sort of urbane brilliance mixed with more tenderness. But something that you said that struck me is that comparison to talking about Julia as this very sort of fascinating and complicated woman. I think that's there too with Jane, because this sort of heroic idea, which I think is absolutely there, the gather roses while you may sort of thing, is really driving it, but it's in a very, very unique way, in that he's wanting Jane to somehow collude on his own understanding of how life-giving her presence is. And so those dears are sort of work because they're both very intimate and very playful, almost manipulative, sort of at the same time. And that's why, for me, they're so fascinating.
Oh, Amanda, you're muted.
Ooh, sorry. Thinking about Jane as the audience, as one aspect of the audience of these poems, I'll just move on to my second question. Shelley wrote in 1821 that the poet and the man are two different natures. But do distinctions between the poet and the man become complicated in the Jane poems? I'm also thinking here about William's insightful statement in Shelley's style, that the lyrics of 1822 transgress the boundary separating words from deeds.
I just like to say something that I feel like the questions run on really nicely together, because I'm thinking that quotation from you, William, the idea of deeds seems like a very 17th century sort of choice of words there, as though the sort of things that Shakespeare plays with his name, will being a sort of a sexualized pun on sexual action. And I wondered if that's what you were sort of thinking as well.
Well, it's also just, I think, worth saying that this is not something we're just as readers imposing on Shelley, that the relationship of words to deeds and deeds to seeds is there in Julian and Madeleine and other Shelleyan texts. So it's something that I think he was already kind of thematizing internally, in some of his poetry. But I do think these last lyrics pose, I mean, you can say certain of the things that we've said so far about almost any poetry, that it's both occupies its own kind of aesthetic space and transgresses it. But the Jane poems do that in, to me, unprecedented and incomparable ways. Not least because they were not just about someone with whom Shelley had this complicated relationship, but they were, and not just addressed to her, but given to her physically, often in circumstances that are extremely complicated, in some cases disturbing. I mean, that's a direction I think this particular part of our discussion needs to go and maybe stay with longer.
Yes, so I don't know how many people have had a chance to look at the manuscript of The Keen Stars Were Twinkling, which is in the Rylands Library in Manchester, but it's on a bit of the same piece of paper that Triumph of Life is written on, and he's torn a sheet in half so that it's a sort of decent sized, maybe roughly, let's call it A4-ish piece of paper. But what really struck me about it was that he's folded it once, and then again, and then again, and then again, to make it almost like a postage stamp. It's very thin paper. And it gives you this overwhelming sense when you realize what the creases mean. I mean, did he poke it under the door? Or, because there were different rooms in one building with a kind of lobby area and bedrooms off. And, and he wasn't sharing a room with Mary, was he, in Villamagny? Or did he secretly give it to her? He seems to have made it tiny so that it was, it was physically secret thing. So yeah, I agree, William. It's hard to think about. I mean, it's a bit like as if Donne's poems say, the kind of, the Donne's poems about sex and girlfriends and things had known recipients or something, but they don't. So it is hard to think of a comparable situation, I think.
I think John Worthen writes about the little packages, the little foldings and bundlings in an interesting way in his recent biography.
It's that transgress word, isn't it, that we're back to, I think, again and again, which is the kind of, what do we do with these poems that are absolutely literary artifacts, but they are indeed part of the life. And William, you pointed out like the possibly generic quality of talking about it like this, that can't we say this of lyric poetry? But I keep thinking about Yeats writing that there's always a phantasmagoria with a poet. And such a follower of Shelley, as we know Yeats was, I keep thinking about that phantasmagoria and thinking that has to specifically come out of an understanding of what Shelley's doing specifically in these late lyrics, where we are so tempted to say Shelley with zero caveats, to judge a man's tastes and behavior, to imagine this performance of the 29-year-old Shelley slipping this envelope under a door. But then at the same time, we're trained, aren't we, professionally, not to think in those terms at the same time. And again, word, deed, artifice, reality. I keep thinking that these poems trouble us out of any kind of nice or ironic thoughts about poetry and drag us back into exactly what it was to write these particular poems at these particular times in this specific marriage, in these conditions, with this imagination. So I suppose Shelley's turned up the temperature on all of us in terms of thinking through how we juggle philosophy, life, love, and, I don't know, morality when we criticize poetry.
I completely agree with that. It's definitely, putting those, is dramatizing that transgression between sort of life and art, rather than simply something like a collapse between them. It's actually a transgression, I think. One thing that I think about maybe the specificity, or I'd like to think about it, is when Keats writes to him about loading every rift with ore. I like to think that in some sense the folding of different audiences and sort of addressees together in such a complicated form is one particularly Shelleyan way of doing that.
These last few comments are prompting me to say another sort of broader thing that I felt going back to the Jane poems. I hadn't actually, I don't know, I can't work out why I haven't been more focused on them in recent years than I have, but it may have to do with what I'm about to say. I found it very painful to imagine what it must have been like to be a woman in the Pisan Circle, not to mention in the Philomene. I mean, the accounts in the Worthen biography, for instance, which I've just read of the boys going off to shoot all day long on their horses, and especially the degree to which Byron influenced the tone and conditions of that sort of aspect of homosocial socializing on the male part. And just, I mean, I'm more used to thinking of the painful part of this from Mary Shelley's point of view, but I've found myself in recent weeks thinking of it from Jane's point of view as well, that it must have just been impossible to be an intelligent, imaginative, and serious woman in that particular environment. And I think that the poems that we're talking about make paying attention to that kind of inescapable, and maybe also in some ways unfathomable, as to, at least unfathomable to me, how it could be that way. And Maddie, I think, having written about Shelley's shame, I wonder if you feel this is a place where those aspects of Shelley's identity that you were getting at in that work of yours could be brought to bear on what I'm trying to identify here in the sort of darker and more troubled aspects of the whole social cultural scene.
Actually, it's Merrilees wrote her fantastic book on shame and resistance. But Merrilees, tell us, because you will know.
Merrilees, please. No, I apologize.
Yeah, well, I suppose I mean the way I wrote about them in my book was in terms of a sort of very deliberate bad faith, where he's deliberately using Jane as a sort of a foil to talk about his own sort of troubled consciousness of this. Is this force of he's this telling us that he's selecting certain bits of his reality and shutting out others, and putting like Kelvin was saying, putting all these analogies and metaphors in place for things where they're so woven thematically together that you can't entangle them. And I see that as a very sort of playful way of making this big Faustian movement of trying to have this very playful thing of getting pleasure through denial. So that's what it's about for me.
I wonder though, is lyric bad faith in general? I mean, not to be awful, but when anybody, especially as you say, William, this is a poet working in 1822 at this point. Is it possible for a male poet writing a lyric to not cherry pick experiences, to not use a woman as a figure that we manipulate in the lyric, and that we critics manipulate as we write every time? We are always complicit in that movement, whether or not we align ourselves with Jane, with Mary, or whatever we think we're doing. I think one thing that Shelley does that is so uncomfortable is we know that Jane Williams really existed. At least Wordsworth had the decency to make it so that Lucy would never be found. It's so troublesome to us because it's not really Jane Williams, but it's not Jane Williams. And I feel provoked. I feel that he's done something transgressive. I think because it wouldn't work, frankly, if he hadn't picked somebody that might connect with all these questions. It would have been no good if he'd invented somebody, and it would have been no good if it was too true. It's because it's so dangerous. It's never quite bad faith. It's always, we're back to Juno and Ixion again, Shelley's figures.
Wasn't he, he was always making the women up though, wasn't he? All of them, in a way. He never quite seemed to see women as people at all. They were half person and half a thing you looked through to some, as if it were a portal to something ideal.
Kelvin, blessings upon your experience. I mean, men do that a lot. And I don't think Shelley is alone in that particular choice.
Life, Madeleine. But he always seems to be reaching towards a self-awareness about that right at the end, doesn't he? That everyone's imagined an Antigone or something, and it sort of he seems to be assuming in a letter to Gisborne, I think it is, that absolutely everybody just routinely thinks of specific women as a kind of lens through which you can try to get a focus on something else, which they're partly a representation of, but sort of partly a channel through to something beyond, which is not flesh.
But all that Platonism, I suppose, I mean, that's one side of Shelley, isn't it, that I think lurks. Well, I mean, what do you guys think? I mean, to me, Shelley knows his philosophy far better than I suppose many ever will. And the Symposium tells him that that's the way to think through romantic love. And his experience is that this is a particular thing he's drawn to. I guess if we can't, I suppose, use the poetry as a record of how he really felt, but what we can see is perhaps, as you say, a self-awareness that grows throughout his career. As you say, I'm really tempted towards that reading, that with every poem we see a burgeoning knowledge of that.
Yeah, except I agree, except I think that there, the self-awareness had still a way to go, or to put it, that Shelley had a potential for a more extensive and deeper kind of self-awareness, I keep feeling in these poems. I found myself, I don't know if others of you have, going back to the Barbara Gelpi book, Shelley's Goddess, because I think she writes really well in that book about both things about Shelley's childhood and his sisters and his mother and his relationship, the kind of foundational part of his formation in having responses to women that were very, in some ways, open and exuberant, and not treating them as fragile creatures that couldn't be engaged with in a full way. and yet there are also these other habits of feeling and thought that come to be very complex. I mean, I don't mean to say I think he was at the time that he died fixed forever in wherever he was in lines written of the Bay of Lerici or any of these other poems, but I don't know. I still think they're quite disturbing aspects of this, and all the more so because he was such a champion of Wollstonecraft. And I mean, what would it have been like for Mary to deal with his thinking as he did about her, about Wollstonecraft, and his being such an open feminist politically, and yet someone whose habits of idealization and I think in some extent still compartmentalization of his feelings about women remained, I don't know, only partly realized or partly developed.
I think that's really, really interesting that you can imagine, yeah, this is developing into some deeper self-awareness. I also feel that in these ones, and also to this question of how can we articulate how unique these ones are. One thing that occurs to me is that yes, you're right, Maddie, that lots of lyrics do have this type of bad faith, but these ones, it seems to me, are unique in trying to get Jane to collude on her own objectification, and that being a sort of shared erotic exchange with each other. That seems to me to be very unique. And in questions of feminism as well, the thing that I would want to suggest might be sort of very uncomfortable as well, is that what he's doing is trying to normalize this idea of the coquette, like that it's okay that we can just be flirtatious with each other, and it's okay that a married woman can respond on some level sexually to a man without it meaning anything. And he's trying to normalize something that's very, very modern to us, maybe so modern that our feminism now sort of struggles with that as well, it seems to me.
Jane wasn't married though, was she?
No.
I mean, she was married. She was
Had been.
married
And she would be.
I mean, it cuts different ways, doesn't it? Not knowing very much at all about Jane. She must have had quite something about her, I think. And that very, very last letter in the letters, the letter she wrote to Shelley, telling him, saying, I hope you don't think that we're going to be like platonic friends.
Yeah.
Whatever she said exactly.
And you quote that in your head note.
Yeah. It's a strange one, really. I mean, it's quite sort of it's flirtatious, definitely flirtatious on her.
I agree. There's something wonderfully flirtatious, but there's something else that I keep noticing about the Jane poems, which is a lack of physical description. We're so used to a blazon, and we're so used to watching a woman kind of. I mean, think about. I can't imagine Marvell leaving at 2 minutes before I got something at least about what the woman. Even Thomas Hardy tells me something about what Emma looks like with her nut brown hair. But with Jane, it almost seems beside the point, the physicality, doesn't it? If we're talking about flirtation, we're talking about the erotic. He's done something where we don't see her as objectified. We don't see her as, I don't know, he doesn't kind of condemn her to any sort of fleshly realm. And I say that without any condemnation of fleshly. I'm half a Catholic, There's something here that seems to resist ideas of, I don't know, sexual ownership, or the idea. I wonder if maybe there's something about the collusion that I love that Merrilees uses that term. But is there something about when we are readers of lyric as well, how we collude with the eye, how we kind of behave? I mean, so often when you read a poem, isn't it awful? You end up smiling at things that you would reject terribly, terribly if somebody said it to you in conversation. I don't know, there's something, Shelley loved Satan so much as a character. I often wonder if that wonderful persuasion that he enjoys and plays around with, the manipulation of lyric, is something that blazes out of here and makes his lyrics fly.
Thinking about, sorry, Merrilees, go ahead.
Yeah, so I was going to say, yeah, no, that's, I think that's a really interesting reading. I was going to add though that I think maybe you wanted to argue that Shelley sort of invented his own type of blazon, where what you get is some kind of mediation through the physical world, trees, Amanda, you know, all sorts of things like that, physical surfaces, tactile experiences. It's a particularly sort of romantic, pantheist kind of blazon, I would argue.
Ooh, I like
I just noticed that Sabrina Ramos in the chat has asked a question about the word sister in line 47 of the invitation, and how what those of us who are going on about Shelley and gender here might have to say about that.
Oh,
sister,
sister, come on, we're all worried about the word sister. Epicyclidian, Lion and Sithna,
Yeah.
that just say sisters are unsafe in the world of Shelley. But I say that as a sister. But I think in a sense, like maybe that idea of the twin of the soul, perhaps we could play with, or perhaps somebody wants to take over before I say awful things about incest on camera. Anybody?
She's the day, isn't she? That's
now you'll have to say them, Maddie, because
I suppose, I don't know, I kind of am really interested in the idea of likeness, that Shelley's so drawn to likeness and difference, I suppose. And one of the exciting things for him, I think, in the word sister is it suggests both of those things, doesn't it? A kinship with a difference. So I think that as I say, we've seen that word come up again and again, haven't we, in terms of intimate relationships with Shelley? So I would connect that back to Epicyclidian, to Leon and Sithna, and think about kinship and likeness. But Merrilees, were you going to say something about sister?
No.
I mean, just to try to, a bit, doesn't it mean that she's the sister of the day that he's talking about? He's not talking about her as though she were his sister or something, metaphorically his sister.
Not this time.
Well, but she sort of lightens Shelley's wintry life in the way that this unexpectedly sunny February has cheered up the Italian winter. So I think, I mean, that's at least a primary sense of sister there.
You're quite right. I was getting overexcited with Shelley and sisters there, probably, I think. But yeah, it's because I keep thinking about that word coming up again and again. But yeah, absolutely, Kelvin, you're right.
Because that deferral is characteristic of the whole thing, like you've been saying, Kelvin, about the, you know, sort of things being metaphorized so carefully. It's that kind of that distance that he's constantly putting Jane in, I think, sister or something. Yeah.
Kelvin, I wanted to ask you and everyone else too, going back to a guitar with Jane, I found myself thinking about the broad question of musical instruments that figure importantly in romantic poetry, and realizing that we're so used, at least I'm so used to thinking about wind instruments and either Aeolian harps, that kind of wind instruments, or trumpets and that west wind kind of instrument. And the important thing, it comes to me in the instance of the guitar, is the instrument that you touch to make music, to make it sing. And how I found myself kind of scrambling and not successfully thinking of similar poems where that kind of instrument figures centrally, and again thinking of how the difference it makes if it's an instrument that the performer touches rather than an instrument that is activated by the breath of the performer, or the bigger breath, the spiritus. Anyone want to talk about that?
I can't think of anything off the top of my head, actually, but other poems about guitars. Well, there's Wallace Stevens, of course, but a bit later. No, nothing comes to mind there. It's a shape like a body, isn't it? The guitar as well, the way it sits on the lap. But she did. I mean, to give Shelley credit, she was good on the guitar. It was the guitar that he got her, having failed to get the harp. But how life would have been different if he'd managed to get the harp, I suppose. With a harp to Jane would have been quite.
But she also, I believe, played piano, and not just those two. I think there was a third.
Harp. She played the harp.
Yeah, the harp. Yeah, so it's also, yeah.
And a very good singer too.
So all of those are instruments that have to do with touching.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, there's a sense of, I mean, I think Merrilees might have something on this, because I think you were talking about this to me when we were just talking on our own, but I was thinking, like, basically you have to, with the lyre, you know, that we get in Coleridge or elsewhere, that there's a sense of, you know, that the wind comes through and, you know, I suppose things fall where they may, but with the guitar, this is something you have to do. This is from you. And it's something that's intimate, and also where the guitar sits on the body. There is something highly intimate and highly aware for Shelley about choosing that particular thing. So yes, it's true she plays the guitar, but it is the instrument that would allow us that kind of physical proximity, I suppose. There's almost something intensely longing even there about the position of the guitar and being touched and what she can draw out of the guitar. I mean, we might argue Shelley's ideas on inspiration here, given how much she enjoyed Ion and translating that, which is, where is inspiration from, internal or external? Jane draws a tune out of a guitar. Is Jane drawing a tune out of Shelley in terms of lyric? I mean, I keep wondering about that idea of control here and what inspiration is.
Yeah, I think yeah, the idea of the guitar being like a sort of being like a lyric problem where things have to be mediated by other things sort of drawn out is absolutely right, and I would want to see it as in a sort of Hegelian terms as well, where you've got this sort of potentially dead matter, which then has to be enlivened by spirit somehow. And that's what I think all the business about how the guitar was chopped down from a tree it is all about, really. It's this idea of at what point, where does the spirit come from, and how can we recapture that from something that is dead? And then of course you've got all the kind of erotic things about Ariel's body like a grave, sort of as in bereft of feeling, sexual feeling, from Jane, and how then that wants to be re-enlivened by Jane's singing. So that's what I would say. The other thing I would say in response to William is not quite the same point, but I think to me it's really surprising how non-breathy they are as poems. And I think the kind of rhythmic control that Kelvin was talking about really speaks to that. I mean, we sort of have this idea that some of them were meant to be set to music, but they're very sort of rhythmically self-contained, and the nature of the space and pauses they leave for music is very distinctive. I think it's not sort of yearning and open, it's very succinct and definite to me.
We haven't talked much about the Serpent Is Shut Out, or the Magnetic Lady, which is, maybe that's the most uncomfortable one of all, isn't it? In the light of much of what we've been saying.
Yeah, it's important. It's another poem that has to do with touching. Indeed,
yeah. And also, it's also quite hard to read out loud, The Magnetic Lady. It's I think you're dead right, Merrilees. You use the word breathy. Yeah, maybe that's it. There's something not lyrical about it. It's sort of quite hard-edged, actually, and very modern feeling indeed, that poem. It's a really odd one, I think. Very uncomfortable.
I completely agree, and that's one thing I was sort of thinking about when I was saying just before about there being a weird separation between mind and body. I think they're even in the first stanza of that is separating the hand on the heart from the sort of the spirit that Jane is trying to access through him, in the mesmeric trance. So that, yeah, it is very curious. I agree.
Just like to take a moment to open this fantastic discussion up to our audience, because I realize the time is just flying past and we've had plenty of comments and a few questions in the chat. So I'd like to welcome you, our audience members. If you have a question, you're welcome to use the raise hand function if you'd like to come on screen and ask your question, or feel free to type it into the chat. I think Anna has a question about gender dynamics and teaching these poems, the problematics of teaching these poems.
Oh, hi, Amanda. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much. I really wanted to ask, thank you for such a fantastic discussion. I'd like to ask the whole panel if you have taught any of the Jane poems to students and how that went. I was just thinking when you were all speaking, first of all, about how the emotional fragility, which I think is something Kelvin said, works in the classroom, in the seminar room, and then all the really interesting discussion about gender dynamics that we've touched upon, how that works with students as well. So, because I remember doing some of Shelley's lyrics as an undergraduate, but not the Jane poems. I actually remember Kelvin talking about When the Lamp is Shattered to us when we were undergraduates, and that being a way of kind of getting into Shelley's kind of intensity when perhaps starting with something like a defense of poetry was quite difficult. So yeah, basically my question is, have you taught these poems before, or would you like to?
I feel I'm cheating. I teach an entire module at the master's level called Love and Lyric. And the Jane poems are a big feature. And it's quite interesting because we move through the lyric tradition. So when we come to Shelley, most of them are stunned by what Shelley seems to have, magnified everything. And it feels a bit like cheating as well, because I'm teaching it as a woman who, perhaps is scary, possibly. So I don't think my students then tend to associate Jane perhaps with weakness. They tend to, perhaps the way I read them, what can I say? But it's been fun to teach. And one of the things that they were focused on, my students, quite a lot, was things that we've discussed a little bit, which is the urbanity of the voice. And a lot of them have looked at Julian and Madeleine and so on in the past, so they're quite drawn to that, but how that combines beautifully with large ethical questions. So one thing one of my students who threw down the text this semester said, but Maddie, I feel like I've got more questions than answers from Shelley. And I thought that was perhaps the greatest thing about teaching Shelley's Jane poems, was that we all left the room with more and more questions, more and more concerns about the parameters of lyric and what it means to be a self-conscious male romantic poet. So I must say, it's been a real pleasure, but intellectually, I recommend everybody goes in with a hard hat.
I haven't taught them. I would like to, and I guess I would be thinking about where we started our discussion tonight, really, and how much you would need to give them a sort of background about sort of the lyric tradition and how much it sort of would make sense with really coming at it from a purely 21st century angle without all of that, and what violence would we be doing to Shelley in the lyric tradition if it was in something like a first year module where you couldn't get all of that history.
I haven't taught them in quite some time, but one memory I have from, I believe it was the last time I did teach them, was the students asking about To Jane the Invitation and To Jane the Recollection. So what happened between the anticipation and the aftermath? There's no present moment of celebratory immediacy. And so we did from there we went to the passage in Skylark. I don't know if I can retrieve it. We look before and after and pine for what is not. And that was fun, but as I recall, didn't really answer the question the student was posing. But I wonder if any of you have thoughts of, it's a very striking thing about those two beautiful poems, that they bookend a moment whose actuality in the present moment is not disclosed to us except retroactively and anticipatorily. And maybe there's something deeply Shelleyan about that.
Just say that apart from that lecture you went to, Anna, I've never taught them. Never.
Well, that lecture was memorable, so.
got Nora with us, which is always a treat, and she's put some really fascinating insight and comments into the chat. So just wondering, Nora, if you'd like to come on screen and just speak with us, especially one about coquette, this word coquette that William touched upon.
Oh, yes, I'd love to hear that. Is there something in the chat about it?
There is, but I wonder if Nora's still with us here.
Oh,
If she'd like
yes.
to come on screen.
I hope she will.
Nora, are you there?
Yeah, I can see her. Hi, Nora.
Hi. Much enjoyed this. I'm not sure that I have anything more to add to this, other than, you know, when somebody says this is the only time this ever happens, my mind keeps going, and I thought, oh well, you're right. There is a thing in prose, and it's this really on the devil and devils. And he says that God and the devil have this pact between them. And though God says he doesn't have any interest in roasting sinners for all eternity, in fact, he's just coquetting. He could, God could choose to let people off and save everybody if he wanted, because he's all powerful. So I'm not sure whether we can read that use of coquette into this, but the idea of tormenting and having fun with or not being serious is kind of common to both, but it's just curious that that's the other place I've noticed where he uses it.
That's great. Thank you for that. That's wonderful. And I think I could be wrong about this, but I think the etymology part of the OED entry says that coquette first enters English as a noun used about men, and was extended from men to women. To the early. I could be fantasizing that, but I don't think so. I think there's something about that's. But thank you very much for that example. And of course, that wouldn't have appeared in the concordance.
No.
You have to know old Shelley's prose to retrieve that. That's great.
We have a question from Oliver in the chat about what happened to the Jane poems after Shelley's death. Oliver asked, did Jane keep these poems? If not, what happened to them? When did Mary come across them? When did she publish them?
I think I can help you there. So Jane did keep them, yeah, most of them. The ones that were copied out fair by Shelley and given to her directly, she kept. And for the whole of her life, and she lived to be an 80-something-year-old lady. But at some point, Trelawney got hold of them from Jane. And when Trelawney died, his daughter inherited them, and she donated them to different libraries, one to each of a range of libraries, one to, I think, the Cambridge, well, Nora will correct me, but one to Cambridge, one to Oxford, one to Glasgow, one to Manchester. So that's why they're all over the place now. And they were first, there were a couple that Lerici, or Bright Wanderers, we must learn to call it, wasn't published until Garnet published it, because for whatever reason, Mary, who must have known about it, chose not to even transcribe it, as far as I'm aware. But the Ghastly Medwin published a lot of the Jane poems material in different ways to mark the 10th anniversary of Shelley's death in 1832. He released various sort of versions of the main ones in different literary magazines. So they were in the public domain from 1832 onwards, most of them. Mm-hmm. Then from the 1860s, they were all there. And that's what happened to them.
Can you mention the other ones that Mary never published herself besides Bright Wanderer? Is it what is the other one?
There's the last one,
Nora will know. Right?
Yeah, it's the
Oh, well, Kelvin.
we meet not as then we parted.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's been the elephant in the room, eh?
Absolutely, yeah. It's still not. It's not a very well-known poem, is it? Even now, it's in a bit of a mess textually, but that could be the very last one I think that he worked on. So when was that first published? It was. Oh, I know where it was published in the Bixby Notebooks, wasn't it?
No, Garnett published a version.
Oh,
Did he?
But it was more accurately done by Foreman. Yeah.
3 notebooks, yeah. Yeah, in Relics, that's right, okay. Yeah, but of course, the Keen Stars of Twinkling was, the draft is in amongst the Triumph of Life stuff.
But Kelvin, when do you think that Trelawney actually got them?
I don't know.
Does anybody know that? I'm mystified.
I've pondered that a lot, and how, when, and how. It's a really funny one, isn't it?
It's got to have been that when Mary Shelley edits the 1839-40, the second edition, that she's got the better versions directly from Jane. She says a friend lent them to her, and she wasn't on friendly terms with Trelawney. So it's sometime after 1840.
Yeah.
But there the trail goes cold.
Indeed. As the whole, isn't it weird the way that Jane Williams knocks around for almost the whole 19th century without anyone thinking to go and talk to her? It's really late that Rossetti is staggered to find out that she's still alive, isn't it? It's Is it in the 1880s even, is it? It is, isn't it? When she was, how old was she when she died? 80 something.
and we haven't even mentioned that she married Thomas Jefferson Hogg.
Or that she never divorced
Yes.
her first husband as well. So she didn't marry. She didn't marry Hogg, did she?
Did they not? I thought they. I can't recall whether they actually married. They were together for.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. For yeah.
We have a question about Edward Williams. Beth would like to know if we know about Edward's reaction to the Jane poems. Of course, sometimes Edward and Jane are a conglomerate being addressed by these poems, but do we have any records of his own reactions?
Well, there's a funny little moment on a little scrap of paper, which is in one of Shelley's unused engagements book, isn't it? Where he seems to challenge Shelley, presumably as a joke, to a duel if he goes on sending Jane poems. Or which he doesn't say that. He says, if you carry on thus. Nora, you probably remember exactly what it says, or Bill, can you remember? Yeah. But he certainly, it's words to the effect of, if you go on like this, we're going to have to
have a duel.
Have a duel. Yeah, I don't think he uses the word duel, actually. I can't remember the exact words, but it's
challenge you.
I think Bieri actually kind of wonders whether it's a serious sort of a challenge to a duel. But I mean, I can't believe that it would be, but
I think
for what it's worth, Don Ryman thought it was serious and then changed his mind later.
Yeah, it reminds me of the homosocial thing that William was saying, though, that it's kind of group of them, kind of having these conversations at various removes of irony and truth, aren't they?
Yeah, well, it's very hard to work out the tone of the little note. Is it completely a joke? Is it a hurt kind of? Is it a mask of irony? But actually, will you please stop sending Jane poems? Or
I'm scrolling to see if I've missed any questions. If anyone has another question, would you like to put your hand up or join us in the chat? Otherwise, I think we'll wind down as we're approaching past. Or do our speakers have any questions for each other?
I'd quite like to take your course, Maddie, on lyrics. It sounds great.
It's made good by a great colleague of mine called Anna Barton, who works on Victorian lyrics. So she keeps me honest and, you know, not trying to claim that romanticism is everything, which is me at my worst. But yeah, it's a great fun course. And I do think, though, that Shelley is kind of the jewel in the crown of what romantic lyric can do and what it can achieve. I wanted to say that I really enjoyed your attention to the prosody, Kelvin, and just how much you showed the importance of the way those words work together and the possibilities. I think and Merrilees and William did the same, where it kept returning me to the exact words, the exact tone, and thinking through the significance of textual, editorial, all these changes. Just the care Shelley took with them, despite their appearance of urbanity. Eventually now, would you guys do, I mean, like we look a lot at the sonnets, don't we, with Shelley? We look a lot at, say, mutability, Ozymandias, when we're lecturing to undergraduates, for example. How many of you would choose now to kind of use Shelley's late lyrics as opposed to looking at Shelley's maybe earlier sonnets, for example? Do you think that we see Shelley profoundly better as he's got older as a poet, or do we see that these are different types of achievements that we need to see as equally valid, but doing something just different?
Well, as a result of our conversation tonight, they seem more interesting than ever to me, I must say, and strange, and not quite like anything else at all, actually.
I think, stylistically speaking, the octosyllabic couplet writing in these last poems, I mean, I'm not saying that the only really brilliant writing is there, but is absolutely breathtaking and unmatched, to my knowledge, by anyone else in the Romantic period. It often that converges, as it does in Bright Wanderer, with the most disturbing and dark sort of psychological and interpersonal material. That's the mixture, the combination is distinctive, unique in my view. I don't know of anything else like it.
Well, thank you all so much for giving us this greater appreciation of the Jane poems. This has been an absolute joy to chair and to listen to you all. And the session has been recorded, so will be available to revisit and to share with others. So please join me with your virtual hands with coming on screen and clapping and thanking Maddie, Merrilees, Kelvin, and William. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
And sharing it so well as well.